I want you to know that benzo recovery is possible even when it feels endless. So today I'm going to share my benzo recovery story, what worked for me, what didn't, and even the things that I learned that I wish I knew from the beginning. I want you to know this is going to be a more positive story. It's not going to list a ton of symptoms because I don't want to trigger people, because I know when I was in that, hearing about other people's symptoms would make me spiral a bit. So if you are curious about what symptoms I went through, I'm going to list them in the description below. Before you read those symptoms, I want you to know something. There are so many questions in the benzo world, comparing notes. Have you been on this one? How long have you been on it? How did you taper? What symptoms did you have? Did you have this specific symptom and for how long? And I get it, because we have a desperate need to find that exact story that matches ours so that we can have hope that our exact situation is going to get better. But I promise you, you are so capable of healing no matter what situation it is that you have. Your situation is actually going to be so unique to you. No matter if you find someone that was on the exact same dose, the exact same brand as you, that tapered the exact same way, the same number of years, had the exact symptoms, and they recovered, it doesn't mean that your situation is going to go exactly the same, because you have a very unique brain and nervous system. So that being said, feel free to look at my symptoms, but don't use it to compare notes to see, well, did she have this or that, or she had this and this and this, does that mean I'm gonna have that? Because there is no way to actually tell. And one of the things about recovery is you have to come to a place where you accept that your journey is going to be uniquely yours. That being said, of course, there are things that you can do along the way to support your brain and nervous system to help yourself get through this. Okay, so let me get into my story. I was put on benzodiazepines when I tried coming off an antidepressant and started suffering withdrawals. I didn't know anything about withdrawals at the time, and I was desperate, so I took whatever the doctors gave me. I personally was given clonazepam, which is also known as Klonopin, and I was on 2 a day. I took that dose religiously every day. I never skipped, I never changed it around, I just stayed on it. I was terrified of coming off. I had been in the benzo groups, read about all the horror stories, and it scared the shit out of me, to be frank. In the time that I was on benzos, I wouldn't really say that I stabilized. Yeah, it might have took the edge off at first, but over time, my anxiety and panic attacks continued. And while I was on them, I did begin to notice a difference in my personality. Now, I was always an introvert, a little bit socially awkward, but I would say that I became even more so once I was on benzos. I felt like a wall had gone up and I wanted to kind of retreat into myself more. I also started having really bad short-term memory and brain fog. And over the years, I became more and more sensitive to the things around me. I knew that the medication was not good for me. I knew that I didn't want to be on it, but I was terrified of facing going off of it. I went through a crazy health journey with multiple other things and factors included, and you can check out my story in my other videos, but for now we're going to keep it strictly on the benzo side of things. So after doing a bunch of work on my anxiety and panic attacks and really feeling a lot better with that, I decided it was time to come off the benzos. I knew that I had to taper very slowly. I learned this from the mistake of coming off too fast of the SSRI in the beginning, and so I knew with benzos, I definitely wanted to go as slow as possible. The method that I personally used was a water taper. I would mix my pill into a cup of water. I had a mini blender that I would blend it in, and then I would drink it. Now, a unique thing about my journey with tapering is my husband and I decided to do what's called a blind taper. I was very blessed and lucky that I had a husband who was willing to support me through this and help me out. So what happened with the blind taper is my husband would extract tiny little amounts out. We found this schedule online, I honestly forget where, that instructed us exactly how to do this very slow and safely. And of course, I let my doctor know that this is what we were doing as well. And I was lucky that I had a doctor who was a fan of me coming off benzos, because she knew that they weren't good either. And even though she didn't necessarily understand how slow you actually have to go or the blind taper method, she said, just do whatever you need to do. So like I said, my husband began extracting tiny amounts out daily of the medication. And what he would do is he would gauge how I was feeling. He would see if, anxiety or other weird symptoms were ramping up and pause. Or I would tell him, hey, I'm not feeling the best, and if you haven't paused me yet, please pause me. And then we would pause for a little bit and kind of intuitively go from there. This worked really well in the beginning, but I did start to experience some symptoms along the way of the taper. I would say my baseline symptoms that I already had increased as we tapered, but it did not get to a point where it was like I couldn't handle it. Even when it came to panic attacks, I had learned a lot about how to overcome that kind of thing, and so I handled it, as gruesome as it felt, along the way. I would say the first 3 or 4 months of the taper were the hardest for me, and then after that I kind of stabilized a bit. Now I have another unique circumstance in my story, and it's that during my taper I actually became pregnant. And so the question became, do I pause the taper so that I don't suffer any withdrawals while I'm pregnant, because it's a huge deal to grow a human inside your body? Or do I try and get off as quickly as possible because the benzodiazepines could pose a risk to the baby? Well, at that point, my husband disclosed to me that I was about 60% off, which was great news. And after talking to my doctor, we decided to just pause the taper because I was on a lower dose at that point, and the risk to the baby was very minimal compared to the risk that might happen if I go through withdrawals. So we paused the taper for the entire pregnancy. I did pretty well. I had the baby, and of course, after I had the baby, I suffered with a lot of symptoms because that is such a shock to your nervous system to go through that when you're already sensitized. And then my husband and I waited till I was about a year postpartum, and then I finally said, okay, I'm ready for you to start slowly weaning me again, just don't tell me when you start. So that's what he did, and it was going pretty well, I think. I had no idea when he had started tapering me, but eventually one day I started to get like a weird, uneasy, chemical anxiety feeling creeping up. And I just thought, okay, I know anxiety, like I've overcome a lot of anxiety before. I'm just gonna let it be here. I'm gonna accept that it's here. It's okay, like something feels kind of off, but it's fine. And I tried to go on with my life, but it kept creeping in and getting bigger and bigger. And I just felt this off feeling in me. I was beginning to have these really weird sensations in my body, which I won't go into, but again, listed my symptoms in the description. And I asked my husband to let me know where I was in the taper, because I thought if I'm pretty low, like if I'm getting close, I want him to pause me at this point because I'm starting to feel really uncomfortable. He kept telling me, you told me that no matter what, not to tell you where you were at in the taper, so I'm not going to tell you. And I kept bombarding him. I kept saying, no, tell me, tell me, tell me. But prior, I had told him, no matter what, don't tell me. So you can see how this had become confusing for him. I wouldn't get off his back, and eventually he caved and he told me, Steph, you have been off the benzodiazepines for about 4 weeks now. I'll be honest, when he told me this, I was shocked. I didn't feel like I was ready to hear that, and I honestly had no idea. And I think this is actually where I made one of the mistakes. For me personally, I think a blind taper was brilliant because I couldn't get in my head about it along the way. But looking back, I kind of would want to know when I was on that last 25 to 30% so that I can mentally prepare myself. Because it truly did shock me. See, going off benzos was my biggest fear. I avoided going off the benzos for 10 years. I was on them for 10 years because I really did not want to face it. And even though I had decided with my husband that I was going to face it and that I wanted a blind taper, I didn't expect to be off so quickly after we had started tapering again. And there comes the second mistake. I think what happened is at the very end of the taper, we jumped too quickly. This wasn't my husband's fault. It was according to the schedule that we had written down, but learning more since, I know that I should have gotten a lot slower before jumping off. Now, that all said and done, there's nothing I can do to change it. And at this point, when I learned that I was off, all the anxiety and the weird sensations and feeling made sense, and learning that I was off actually induced a panic attack. And as you can imagine, when you're already in that sensitized state, once a panic attack starts, it can be hard to stop. So again, not getting into too much detail about my symptoms, that was kind of like the spark that lit the fire, and I suffered tremendously more than I ever had in my entire life, and it was significantly hard. I think it was a mixture of my brain trying to rebalance after coming off the benzodiazepines, my nervous system shock of learning that I was off it, and my nervous system saying like, hey, I feel really fragile, this doesn't feel safe.
I'm gonna freak the fuck out.
If you're in the benzodiazepine world, you probably know that benzos work by enhancing your GABA. GABA, spelled G-A-B-A, is your brain's main calming neurotransmitter. When someone takes benzos regularly, your brain adapts to that calming signal. It begins to down-regulate its own calming mechanism, and then often up-regulates excitatory systems like your glutamate to compensate. So even if you've had a slow and careful taper, the brain and nervous system don't necessarily automatically bounce back. When the medication is gone, that calming break is suddenly weaker. and those excitatory systems are still revved up. And so it makes your nervous system more likely to tip into hypervigilance. But I want to be clear, this doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you or that you're broken. It means that you're temporarily sensitized and temporarily unbalanced. I think one very important thing is to not think of it that you have a brain injury. This wording alone can put you into the victim mindset. Now let me say, before anyone jumps on me, yes, you are a victim of this. This is one of the worst things that anyone could possibly ever go to. But once you become a victim of something, there's a choice. You decide to stay the victim or decide to become the hero of your story. There are certain aspects that you definitely have no control over. So that all being said, I would say that my journey took about a year and a half of not feeling well and experiencing all these symptoms before I started to stabilize. And I know some of you are gonna hear this and say, well, I'm 5 years out and I'm still freaking out. Some of you are gonna hear it and say, holy shit, a year and a half of that suffering, I can't possibly do that. And I want to address both of those things. I remember when I first came off and I read stories of people saying they suffered with the symptoms 6 months to like 3 years later. That was something that I did not want to accept. I remember thinking, when is this going to go away? How much longer do I have to suffer like this? I cannot do this any longer. But I want to tell you something. The biggest change happened when I finally accepted that this might take a while. See, acceptance can be that line between feeling like shit and going through a nightmare and suffering through that nightmare the entire time. It took away a lot of the suffering when I decided to accept, yes, I'm going to wake up feeling like this day after day after day for a long time, but one day I'm going to feel better. And I held on to that hope. I wrote out temporary on a piece of paper and I hung it up on my wall and I looked at that word every day to remind myself that this was not forever, but it was something that I currently was going through. Now, about some of the people that suffer for years and years and years out, I want to say this lightly because everybody's circumstance is so different. Like I said, everyone's brain chemistry, everyone's nervous system, everyone's dose they were on or how quickly they had to come off, whether they were cold turkeyed or weaned off or whatever it was, is completely unique to them. And those things are all going to heavily influence what goes on. And after coming off benzos, some nervous systems naturally re-regulate over time and others can stay stuck in threat mode for a very long time. Because the nervous system doesn't just respond to chemistry, it responds to perceived safety. So if your nervous system learned that all the sensations that you're going through mean danger, it's going to run them on a loop for years on end. Of course, it's going to learn that they mean danger when you're suffering through that. But over time, you can teach your nervous system that you actually are safe despite the symptoms. And this is also what has really helped me on the recovery journey. A slow taper will reduce shock to the system, which is super important, but it does not automatically teach the nervous system that you're safe. Over time, the chemical side, the brain aspect, actually does normalize because the brain is very neuroplastic, it's very intelligent, and your body actually knows what to do. Your brain does not stay injured for life when it comes to this, but it's the threat response in your nervous system that can stay conditioned. And this is understandable. Coming off something like benzos is traumatic as fuck. What benzos do is they cause functional changes in the brain. They don't cause actual structural destruction. Say that 10 times fast. Your receptor sensitivity changes. Your stress circuits become more overactive, signaling shifts, and the balance is altered. And all of that can look completely terrifying symptom-wise, but it is also completely reversible. There is actually brain imaging evidence that shows that during withdrawal or protracted symptoms, certain brain regions show altered activity, and GABA receptor availability is reduced temporarily. Follow-up imaging actually shows normalization over time. So your brain can actually be intact, healthy, and capable of recovery, but your nervous system is usually what remains sensitized if it's been a while. This does not mean that your symptoms aren't physical, aren't intense as hell, or involuntary, because it is all those things. Okay, so let me share what I did in that year and a half to help me get through my own personal hell, to put it lightly. Like I said, acceptance was huge. Accepting that I was gonna go through this and it was probably gonna take a while changed my tone from suffering constantly to, Okay, this sucks, it's horrible, it's a nightmare, but it is what it is. I also looked up success stories. I screenshotted the ones that really spoke to me and I kept those on my phone and I read them over and over and over again to remind myself that recovery from this was possible, because your brain is going to convince you otherwise. Now, I'll be honest, a lot of the groups can be super negative when it comes to benzo withdrawal and a lot of different things on Facebook. There are some that are actually super positive and supporting, but I had to personally take a break from those groups for a long time, because when I went on there, people talking about their symptoms and how much they were struggling all the time was really triggering for me and just like reinforcing that fear. So I realized that I had to stay away from the benzo groups while I recovered. And that's why I kept those screenshotted success stories on my phone, so that anytime I was getting that craving of reassurance, I would just read those stories. I also listened to a lot of success stories on YouTube, which is why I'm inspired to make one now, because it was something that really helped me get through. And aside from that, I listened to like a lot of motivational speeches from tough people who had been through a lot of shit, even if it wasn't necessarily benzodiazepine withdrawal. At first, I could not tolerate watching TV or listening to music, but little by little, I inched my way into doing that to show my brain and my nervous system that I was still safe to find these tiny little pockets of enjoyment, and they were tiny. Like, even for a split second at a time, I would get a flick of, okay, maybe Steph's there. Nope, she's gone again. And when I finally could tolerate watching TV, it was often nature documentaries, because anything else was like way too stimulating. So I listened to those motivational speeches over and over and over again throughout my days to kind of like tell myself, you got this, you can do this. I didn't put pressure on myself to heal on a certain timeline. I just accepted that where I was at was going to be where I was at. I personally didn't use any supplements because I was also terrified of those. And I leaned into whatever support that I could possibly grasp at the time. And for me, that was my husband and my parents. Yes, I was very lucky to have them supporting me and being there for me along the way. But there were times where they were working or busy and I had to get through it on my own. And honestly, those times where I was forced to face things alone, to go through things alone, is actually what helped me start to have this trust in me that I could do it. Even though I didn't want to eat, because eating was the last thing I wanted to do when I felt like I was dying, I would force myself to nibble things here and there because I knew it was important to keep my body as stabilized as I possibly could at the time. At one point, I was suffering a lot and I even called the suicide hotline, even though I didn't feel like necessarily doing that. I just needed someone to talk to because I felt like I just couldn't stand to be in my own skin anymore. And the lady on the other side, she didn't understand benzodiazepine withdrawal, but she was actually very helpful to talk to and kind of comforting. I also had a therapist that I also called on and off, and even though she also did not understand benzodiazepine withdrawal, she had never dealt with that before, she was also super comforting and saying like reassurance and like, you're gonna get through this and things like that, which is all you really need to hear when you're going through that. I talked to a couple people who had also been through benzodiazepine withdrawal and came out the other side, and they were also very reassuring for me. So I grabbed reassurance anywhere I could get it until the point where I eventually told myself, okay, now it's time to reassure yourself. My brain questioned things the entire way. I obsessively thought about whether I was going to get better, whether I was getting worse, how long this was going to take. And I just had to keep going back to that sign that said temporary and understand that this wasn't going to last forever, because inevitably I was going to heal. I would say after a year and a half, I started feeling like myself again. At first, it came in little blips. I didn't get those windows and waves that everyone talks about, where like a huge wave would come, but then it would settle and I'd get this window. I never had that. It just felt like a big wave the entire time. And then eventually little blips came in where it was like, oh, I feel present, I feel here, I feel like myself. I kind of laughed at something. And those blips continued to expand more and more over time to the point where I didn't even see it happening. It just became my new normal to feel more like myself again. And I did. I finally got to that point where I started to feel more like myself, and I felt like that dark cloud that was suffocating me was finally behind me. I would say I definitely did have a little bit of PTSD from this experience. So I was kind of looking over my shoulder like, am I going to get hit with symptoms again? Are they going to come back? And I was very paranoid for a while. My guard started to calm down a little bit over time, but anytime I would have any sort of issue that would remind me of the symptoms or any sort of negative thoughts, I would start to loop on it again and spiral. For example, I had a little bit of a health scare with a mole that might have been cancerous at one point, and it took months before I could actually get it tested and get the results. And in those months, I was obsessively thinking about it, obsessively Googling. I was spiraling about it without even realizing that that is what I was doing. And so that was continuing to signal the fear to my nervous system. However, my nervous system had stabilized enough to where I didn't go immediately back into all of that shit. It's just that I was at this baseline of like being on edge all the time and I didn't even see it. So I think because of that, some of my symptoms persisted and they started to grow a little bit. Now these symptoms, I highly doubt are because of coming off the benzos, because I had these symptoms at a baseline before going on the benzos, and these symptoms were histamine related. However, I know benzos also affect histamine, so they kind of block it a little bit while you're on it from my understanding. So I think that once I came off, I became even more sensitive to histamine type issues. And after I had recovered from the benzodiazepine withdrawal aspect and my nervous system started to feel more safe and I felt like myself again, those histamine symptoms were still there, but it was more like they were whispering. And the more I fed into the fear of like the anxiety and the thoughts that I started to get after coming off it, the more those raised. So I didn't even see that my nervous system was still sensitized. It was still on edge. It still hadn't like completely said, okay, you're completely safe now. I didn't know that that was my nervous system. I thought that the histamine issues were like a physical thing that I needed to fix. And so you'll see in my other videos, I talk about my journey with MCAS and histamine issues and other symptoms. And those symptoms actually started to come more after I recovered from the benzo issues. But I want to be clear, this doesn't mean that's going to happen to you, especially if you learn to work with your nervous system through this process, because as long as your nervous system feels safe, you're not going to start to develop other issues. That all being said, I am now about 4 years off benzodiazepines. I live a completely happy life. I experience joy regularly. I work, I take care of my son, I have a healthy marriage. Things are really incredible compared to where they were 4 years ago. I didn't see at the time that my nervous system did become sensitized because of everything that I had gone through with the benzos. And because I didn't address that, I did have other issues, like I said, with the histamine and MCAS pop up that I have also had to learn to heal over time. So I would say right now, I still have a nervous system that is a bit more sensitive than the average bear, but it is definitely nothing like benzo withdrawal at all, and my life is good. Best piece of advice that I would give to anyone that has came off benzos, is weaning off benzos, or is about to wean off benzos is to take care of your nervous system before, during, and after. Know that what you're going through might be challenging, but it is temporary. Also, stop comparing your story to other people's, because yours is going to be completely unique. Your symptoms are likely completely normal because there are a wide variety of symptoms that people can have when they go through this. And yes, they will resolve over time, especially if you work at signaling safety to your nervous system. You will not be a horror story. You will not be someone stuck in this for decades as long as you teach your nervous system that you are safe. And there are so many different ways that you can do this, but you can check out some of my other videos to learn how. I also had somebody ask the question of, did you feel like you lost yourself, like a part of you died when you went through this? And I would say 1000% yes. But here's the good thing about that. The part of me that died, it sucked, and I had to grieve that. I had to grieve my old life before I went through all this, and I had to grieve the time that I lost going through everything. And after that, and as I recovered, a new me was born. And I would say it's a more me version of me than it has ever been. So yes, you will feel like a part of you died, or maybe all of you died. You will completely lose yourself in the process sometimes. You will feel that grief, and let yourself feel it. Let yourself grieve, but just know a new you is waiting underneath all of that darkness, just waiting for the right time to emerge. And when it does, you're going to be so thankful. And sometimes you might even think what I went through was actually worth it. I know that's a bit crazy to say, but that's how I feel. So yes, if you're going through benzo withdrawal or you're tapering and you're terrified, know that you can get through this, that you will heal, that it's all temporary, that your brain is highly adaptable, your nervous system is adaptable, and you can do this. If you have any specific questions about my journey, or anything benzo related, please drop it in the comments. I'm here to help. I'm here to spread hope because I know it can be such a dark and desperate time. Just remember that it's not forever and you can do this.